Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, April the 27th, 2021. It is currently 8:47 a.m. Central Time, and you know where I'm at. I'm here in the sanctuary of Victory Baptist Church, and you know where Victory Baptist Church is located, in the middle of nowhere, Texas. And yes, I did not start with our professional intro. I chose not to do that because this is a situation where I just want to have a conversation with you, and I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and we're going to ask questions in order to try to answer, well, some questions asked by a listener. Now, I've always stated this, and I will say it again. I do this podcast for you. That's why I do this, right? I don't do it just to hear myself talk. Now, you may think that I do, but I don't do this to hear myself talk. I do this because I truly want to create a podcast that challenges people to think, that tries to offer spiritual, food for people to try to help people along in their own spiritual journey. So I'm doing this for you. So whenever you email me, whenever you send me a message, listen, if you ask a question, if there's something you want me to study, that always jumps to the top of the stack, right? I may have a stack of things I want to talk about. In fact, right here, I have a stack of stuff that I would like to talk about today. But I received an email from a listener just a few minutes ago, and immediately, what am I doing? I'm turning on the microphone to try to answer their question. That's the way it works. Now, sometimes I think people ask a question and they're like, wait a minute. You did 3 hours of broadcast to answer my question. I had no desire to listen to 3 hours of broadcast. You did 3-hour broadcast on trying to answer my question, and I had no desire to listen to all of that. I understand that sometimes my answers are very lengthy, okay, as the members of my church will do. Hey, Pastor, I've got a question, but I want the short answer. Now, I think that that's extremely offensive and rude and hurtful, but okay, no, I'm joking. Now, I understand sometimes they want the short answer, but I tend to think of it this way. If you want a short answer, do you really want an answer? Because if you just want a short answer, you may not really want to know an answer, because sometimes questions require there's a lot of things to consider when trying to answer a question, especially when they're theological in nature. There's not always simple answers. They're like, well, what about this perspective and this perspective and this perspective? So I'm going to what I decided to do is I saw the question and I immediately said, you know what? Grab a couple of notes, grab a Bible dictionary, a Bible, and let's just talk about it. Let's just talk about it. Okay. This is not, I know I've got to state this right from the start. This is not designed to be an in-depth study. This is supposed to be an impromptu discussion based off a question asked by a listener, which may require us to come back and do a more lengthy study and teaching on the subject matter. And the reason I have to say that is because this is going to spark some controversy, because this is what we're getting ready to talk about is one of those subjects that for some reason, some people become very invested in this subject. In fact, it almost becomes, how can I say this? It almost becomes their cause. It also almost becomes like the most central doctrine to the Bible. And it's all they ever want to talk about and promote and talk about and promote. And it's almost like, okay, unless everyone else sees it from their perspective, everyone else is wrong. And this is the thing they need to change. Like this becomes the ultimate cause. And I'm always somewhat confused by that. Like, why is this such a central issue for many? I'm not saying that this is true of the listener. I'm just saying that I have had to deal with this question from a lot of people, and man, they get so bothered over this. Like this, you would think that of all the theological issues that you could find in the Bible to be concerned about and that you want to change everyone's opinion on, it wouldn't be this issue, but for some, this becomes the defining issue. It defines one's spirituality. It defines whether you should go to that church or not go to that church. It really becomes this major issue. And I think we always have to be careful. Whenever that begins to happen to us, we have to ask ourselves, am I making a minor issue a major issue. Now, at the same time, we got to be very careful never to reduce something to a minor issue when maybe it is a serious issue. I just think we have to be very careful how we conduct ourselves whenever there's a controversial issue. All right, there's more I'll say about that as we move forward. But let's just jump in. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to be discussing head coverings. Now, depending how long you've been a Christian, depending on the church that you've gone to, you may have never even heard a meaningful discussion on the subject. Your church may never talk about it. Nobody in your church may wear a head covering. So it just may be like a foreign concept to you. You don't even know it's controversial. But trust me, the first time you meet someone who's really big into the head covering kind of idea, they are going to tell you, like, it becomes like the issue. And in many cases, anyone who doesn't agree with them on head coverings, basically you're treated like, okay, you don't know the Bible, you don't understand the Bible, there's something wrong with you, you're not spiritual, and that's the problem with your church. Like if you get all the women in the church wearing head coverings, now you're a spiritual church. Now you're a good church. Now that's all that matters. And I know that in many cases maybe they don't intend to come across that way, but it is crazy. I way back in the olden days when I was on Facebook, there would be times that these head covering people would find me on Facebook, and it would just be like, that's all they would want to talk about. Or I start getting bombarded with emails. The women in your church don't wear head coverings. Your church is not spiritual. That's why I would never go to your church. I'm like, you live 5,000 miles away from me. What are you even like? What is that supposed to be a threat that you would never go to my church? You live 5,000 miles away. You would never go anyway. But it would just be like, it becomes this major issue. So this is what we have to do. Everybody needs to take a deep breath. And let's just try to think about this biblically, carefully, and logically. All right? Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Before I even get to the email, I'm going to ask you a question. What do you feel is most important? The symbol of something or the reality of something? Now, I know you may think that's a strange question in regards to head coverings, but I really want you to contemplate this. What is more important, the symbol or the reality? This symbolizes something. This is to symbolize this. This is to demonstrate this. But if it becomes an empty symbol, then what good is the symbol? The symbol is only as good as the reality that it points to. If it just becomes all shadow with no substance, then it becomes, it can lead to the shadow becoming the focus and the shadow becoming more about building up an individual. I've got to be careful how I say this. Okay. I just want you to think about this. What's more important, the shadow, the symbol, or the reality or the substance? I think you're going to have to acknowledge that the reality, the substance is more important. But if you're so preoccupied with the shadow, then sometimes the shadow and the symbol becomes more about you than it does even what that symbol represents. I'm trying to think of an example, but we'll leave it there. This will all make sense before we are done. So what's more important, symbol or reality, shadow or substance? All right, this is very key as we move forward here. All right, now let's get to the email question. Let's get to the question itself. All right, I received this at 8:19 a.m. At 8:19 a.m., I probably was live on the air talking about police shootings when I received this. Now, I'm not saying the person even knew that I was live on the air. That's perfectly okay. So while I was on the air, and as soon as that broadcast ended, I checked my email, and here's the email. It says, "Hello again, Mr. James. Have you studied the passage about head coverings in 1 Corinthians chapter 11? Now, let me stop right here. Yes, I have studied it. Our church went through the book of 1 Corinthians. It took us, I think, 4 years to make it through 1 Corinthians. So we have studied it. And I'll just write for transparency's sake, our church does not practice head coverings. nobody here is required to wear head coverings. So that would probably give you some idea of the conclusion I came to at that point, but let me make it very clear. This is very important. Whatever I understood about the situation in the past doesn't mean that it was right then or that it's right now. I'm always willing to listen to questions again, relook at the subject again, and be willing to change my mind at any time. Right? Everyone must do that. So I'm not going to rely on my past understanding. We're going to relook at the situation again today, maybe even moving into the future, depending what kind of controversy this sparks, and then we'll see where it leads us. If I change my opinion on it, I'll change my opinion on it. So I don't want you to think just because I want to be very transparent to acknowledge that, yeah, I have studied it, and we did come to a conclusion that may not be the conclusion other people have come to, but I'm willing to change my view based off a present study. In other words, today's question means it's a new study, so past understanding becomes irrelevant. That's the way I try to approach everything, and every Christian should approach that. So there are people listening. You've got your mind made up about head coverings. Either you're for, against, or you don't care. But it's in the Bible, so it has to be discussed and it has to be talked about. So we're going to do this again. So here's what I would say, all right? 1 Corinthians 11 is the passage that is brought up. So this is what I'm going to challenge everyone to do, and this is what I would challenge this person to do. Do a chapter summary method of Bible study on 1 Corinthians 11. Do a chapter summary method of Bible study on 1 Corinthians 11. I would really challenge you to do this, because if you will do a chapter summary method of Bible study on 1 Corinthians 11, then you don't have to rely on what I tell you or what anybody else tells you. You can then look for yourself what is actually in the chapter, and then you can draw your own conclusions. All right. Let me give you, I'm going to try to give you the quick steps for the chapter summary method. All right. I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm not going to be able to explain the method, but everyone can do this. All right. Whenever you have a passage of scripture where there's great controversy, right? 1 Corinthians 11 mentions head coverings. There are drastically different schools of thought on this. Right? Drastically different schools of thought. Some say the head coverings were for that period of time. It has nothing to do with us today. It was dealing with a cultural issue. We can move on. Just like in 1 Corinthians deals about eating meat offered unto idols. Okay, how do we apply that today? Like there's lots of situations that were specific to the church at Corinth. Clearly, this is a very specific situation dealing with the church of Corinth, because you would have to ask yourself, are head coverings addressed anywhere else in the New Testament? If you can't find it mentioned anywhere else, then most likely this has something to do with what was going on in Corinth. That is very important. But the issue is, whenever you have a controversial subject where there's so many different schools of thought, right? And I was getting ready to go through the different schools of thought, but basically it only related to the church of Corinth, that the head covering can be worn or can't be worn, or the head covering must be worn. So there's a lot of different schools of thought. I was going to go through all of them, but right now we won't do that. Bottom line is, anyone who reads 1 Corinthians, I keep saying 13, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, okay, if I said 13, I apologize. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and comes across the section dealing with head coverings, and then they start trying to read about them, they're going to get all of these different schools of thought, everyone saying that they are right. Here's what you have to do. Whenever you come to a controversial section of Scripture, don't listen to everyone telling you that they're right. Don't listen to everyone telling you what to think about it. Ignore everyone. Pick up your Bible and do a chapter summary method of Bible study on the chapter where the controversial section of Scripture appears. The reason you do this is because now you have a foundation which to stand upon, so that you don't have to rely on me or anybody else. And this is very important. Remember, the goal of Bible study is not to interpret the passage. It's to observe everything in it. Until you've done a thorough Bible study A thorough Bible study where you have done good observation until you have that observation down, where you know everything in 1 Corinthians 11. You know everything from the first verse to the last verse of the chapter until you can explain to me everything in that chapter. Then you're not qualified to draw a conclusion about it. But you've got to do the observation. So here's what you do. You take 1 Corinthians 11, you read it 5 times. One of those times is out loud. You read it 5 times. One of those times are out loud. That's all you do. You just read it over and over, at least 5. That's a minimum. That's a minimum. All right. The more you read it, the more you're going to see structure. You're just observing. You're not trying to interpret. Don't interpret anything. You're just reading to observe. Read to observe. After you've read it 5 times, and one of those times out loud, give the chapter a short title. A short title that kind of captures everything in the chapter, that kind of summarizes what the chapter is about. All right? Then outline the chapter. In your outline, do not interpret it. Don't offer an interpretation in your outline. Your outline is simply to get on paper what is in that chapter. So it's just your observation, right? How do you break the chapter down? How many sections do you break this chapter down? 1 Corinthians 11 has 34 verses. We know that one of the issues in this chapter is the Lord's Supper. So you can already break down one section in the Lord's Supper. You have another section here referring to coverings. So do you have 2? Can you break 1 Corinthians 11 down into 2 parts? Head coverings and the Lord's Supper. Head coverings and the Lord's Supper. Can you do that? Would that be accurate? Now, once you break them down into 2 parts, then can you break them down into subpoints? Just try to get the content on paper somehow. Just to, listen, not to interpret. Anything you write on paper, if it has an interpretation, you've messed up. It's just observation. You've read it 5 times. Now you've got to get what's on the page on paper. Because by writing down and outlining what is there, that's the best way to ensure that you saw everything that was there. All right? Next, who are the chief people or the key people in the chapter? Who are the key people in the chapter? Next, is there a key verse that really summarizes the whole chapter? Do you think there's a key verse? All right? Next, what are the key words in the chapter? What are the key words? All right, next, cross-reference. Are there any other scriptures that would offer insight into understanding this chapter? Next, challenges. What do you see in the chapter that you just don't understand? Now, you may say, I don't understand head coverings. That's perfectly okay. But now you've at least observed everything there. So if someone comes along and tries to say something about the chapter, you can go, no, that's not accurate. I've read the chapter 5 times. I've outlined the whole thing. I've cross-referenced. I've looked at the key verse. I've looked at the key people. That's not an accurate description of what's there. All right. Then you just write out the central lessons. What are the central lessons you learn from the chapter? All right. Just make sure you at least do that. If you don't do that, this is what I have to say. If you're not willing to do that, then it comes down to how much do you really want to know in regards to this subject. All right. But that helps avoid all of the noise and all of the controversy. All right. Now, let's go back to the question. Yeah. You're like, I asked you a question, you gave me homework. Yeah, that's the way it works, right? Because do you want to study the Bible? Or do you want to know what the Bible says? Or do you want to constantly rely on everyone telling you? Look, I can tell you what it means, but what difference does it make? 5 seconds later, you can get on the internet and find someone who will say that I'm wrong. Right? And then you can, after you listen to them, you can 5 seconds on the internet, you can find someone else to tell you that they're wrong. You're going to find 900 opinions on this. Everyone telling you that they're right. Well, what are they basing it off of? 1 Corinthians 11. So then guess what? Who needs to be the expert on 1 Corinthians 11? You do. And when I say an expert, not an expert in interpreting it, an expert in observing everything in that chapter so that no one can misrepresent it, no one can twist it, no one can make it say something that it doesn't say because you know what it says. That's very important. All right, now let's go back to this. Hello again, Mr. James. Have you studied the passage about head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11? I have. And we've talked about it. What is your understanding about how women today should apply this? My Baptist church does not practice this. If I did this, I would be the only one and would draw attention to myself, which raises a lot of questions for me. My son, who is interested in Eastern Orthodoxy, keeps telling me I should do this. He does force me to re-examine my beliefs. Well, great that he's challenging you to re-examine your beliefs. That's wonderful. Now, here's the first question I would ask. If you were to wear a head covering, why would you do so? Would you do so because you feel Scripture commands it? Would you do so because you believe the head coverings represent something as a symbol and you want to show that symbol? Now, this is where it becomes problematic. Are you more worried about the symbol than the reality of what it supposedly represents? That's where the issue is. So there's a lot of questions of why. Now, I do think it's very good that, hey, if I was to wear this head covering, it would draw all this attention to me. And she stated that raises a lot of questions. Very good. Because the minute you realize, wait a minute, I'm going to be drawing all of this attention to me, then what are you hoping to accomplish? Like, are you trying to show all the other women in the church that you're more godly, you're more submissive, you have a greater level of modesty than all of them? If it turns into that becomes problematic. And this is what I've seen so many times. A woman will decide head coverings, and then they go out on a crusade. Like every woman needs to wear a head covering. Every woman needs to wear a head covering. And they've got to convince everyone. Well, at that point, what is the head covering just become your new passion, your new hobby, your new crusade? If you're wearing head coverings because you believe that this is a symbol of submission, you believe that it's a symbol of modesty, if you believe because this makes you in obedience to Scripture, then you do so quietly, carefully, and you don't turn it into drawing attention to yourself. Now, you may draw attention to yourself, but if you believe this is required to be obedient to Scripture, then you do it, but you don't. You can do it in a way where it draws attention to yourself because you're wearing something on your head that nobody else is. But you can also say, look, this is just an issue in my spiritual journey, this is a conclusion I've come to. I'm not here to argue with you, fight you, or try to place this upon you, right? I'm not here to get into that. You can do it in a way where you don't make it about yourself. You know what I'm saying? Like you can draw attention to yourself because you're wearing something on your head, but you can still do it in a way where you don't make it about yourself. But if every second you get, you're trying to pull a woman aside and go, hey, you need to wear a head covering. Hey, you need to wear, and all of a sudden you're acting like you're the shepherd of that church and you're trying to convince all the women in that church that they need to do something that the pastor has not articulated, then at that point, you're not even showing submission to your pastor. You're not even showing submission to your pastor. Well, then there's a problem. So if the head covering is a symbol of submission and you're acting in a way within the church that's not even showing submission to your pastor, then the symbol really becomes meaningless and useless. Because I've seen some Christian women who get convinced of head coverings and their pastor isn't, and then they're basically like, my pastor's an idiot, my pastor's wrong. Well, thank you for such a godly submission. And then they start causing problems in the church by trying to convince all the women that the pastor's wrong. And then it becomes almost this movement. That becomes just, look, that goes against the very thing that most likely you think the head covering represents. So let's do a little work here, all right? Let's do a little work here, right? And we're just going to ask a lot of questions and we're going to see what we can do, all right? 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 3 through 16 seems to address the issue of women and head coverings. So let's look at it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 3 through 16. Here we go. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and that the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Let's stop right there. Now, verse 3 is clearly outlining kind of levels of authority. right? I think I'm just gonna try to say this in a very simple way. Now remember, I'm trying to make this simple. I don't want to confuse anyone here. I'm going to make this simple so that we can try to get to the basic idea here. So we know that the head of every man is Christ, and that the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So it's trying to give you this order of authority, order of leadership. Okay. Verse 4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. So it appears that the man, if he was to cover his head, he would be dishonoring. He would be dishonoring his head. All right. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. Now let's stop right here. Now first, very important. The context, the situation is obvious. If you were to wear a head covering, according to this verse right here, you would wear it 2 times. When you pray or when you prophesy. Now we say, what the women are prophesying? So wait, what are they? Is this referring to a spiritual gift of foretelling something that was going to happen? Is this speaking of a spiritual gift of foretelling or just forthtelling, just proclaiming God's word? How should that work? How does that work within the church? All right. So praying or prophesying would be the times that this would be worn, it appears. Okay. Well, if you're praying, is this praying only inside the church or is this praying at home? Well, these are questions you have to ask, right? So praying or prophesying with her head uncovereth, dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. To do this would be like her having her head completely shaven. Now, clearly we're in a cultural context going on here, right? Because clearly a shaved head seems to indicate something that you don't want indicated, right? So that seems, so it's just interesting that you've got the covering and now you've got the shaved head concepts all coming together. All right, verse 5. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovereth dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. Okay, I've already read that, just reading it again. Verse 6. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn, but if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. So we got the covering and we got the hair. There's a correlation going on here, which is interesting. It's almost like if you don't wear a head covering, then you just are to have your head shaved. Now, we got to get into a lot of discussions here, okay? So, because this raises lots of questions that you have to think about this. So, let's say your church says a woman should wear a head covering, and if she doesn't, she should have her head shaved. Is that a part of your church rules? Hey, if you come to this church and you don't wear a head covering and you're going to be a member of this church, then you have to have your head shaved. If you enforce the head covering, do you force the head shaving? If you convince that head coverings are biblical, then do you tell every woman who doesn't have a head covering she should shave her head? Are you saying, like, you can't just pick and choose from this. You can't just grab what people want from it. You've got to think all of this through, right? Verse 7, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the woman created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels? Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Judge in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Now that's interesting in verse 13. Judge in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered. Now, how do we read this? Is he saying, look, here's my argument, now you make the judgment for yourself? Or he's like, here's making an argument, now you should come to the right conclusion here. Verse 14, now this is interesting. Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? Now, that's interesting, because if a man prays covered, he dishonoreth his head. It's a shame. So now if a man has long hair, it's a shame. So in other words, does long hair, if a man had long hair, does that in a sense become his head covering? I'm just asking the question, because this becomes very important. If a man has long hair, that becomes basically his head covering. Then can hair serve as a head covering? And then how do we work this in a church? Do you have rules about long hair? Now, maybe it's not as prevalent today because men's hairstyles are much shorter today than they were back in the 80s. There was a lot of debate in the 80s and the 90s about, men having long hair, men not having long hair, men not having long hair. Probably was a bigger controversy even going back into the 60s with the hippie movement. So it was, how does your church handle men with long hair? And what is considered long? Do you have a rule about that? How does that work? Does this have some cultural significance going on here that is hard to even apply to our modern context? All right. So it's just interesting that now we've had head coverings, and now it comes to if a man has long hair, it's a shame. Now look at verse 15. But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory for her hair is given for her for a covering. That sounds pretty interesting, right? So is the woman's hair her covering? Can the woman's hair be her head covering? If she has long hair, that is her head covering. She doesn't need an additional head covering? Or are you saying, no, the woman should have long hair plus a head covering? She should have both. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom. Okay, now this is interesting. So verse 15, but if a woman have a long hair, it is glory for her hair is given for her for a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. We have no such custom with what? Now that's 1 Corinthians 11:16. I'm going to look something up here. That's a very interesting verse. That's a very interesting verse here. Now, hang on. I'm going to look something up. Because it's saying if someone is contentious, we have no such custom. No such custom where? I bet you there's a lot of different interpretations here. I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 11, 16. All right. There's a lot of articles that pop up. All right, now I'm going to read this from different translations. So verse 16, I think there's two very key verses here in this section about the woman's hair being her covering. That's got to be at least considered. Is it possible but that the woman's hair can serve as her covering? And number two, verse 16, which says, if anyone wants to be contentious, I'm going to read this from a number of translations. About this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. New Living Translation. But if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, and neither do God's other churches. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice. If anyone is inclined to dispute this, we have no other practice. So it seems like he's like, okay, don't be contentious about this because we have no other practice than this. Right? So that's interesting, not super helpful. All right, here we go. Okay. I'm just gonna read some of the commentaries here. But if any man seems to be contentious, this argument and the appeal to their own good sense having been completed, the Apostle Paul now adds that if, after all, someone continues to argue the matter, and is not satisfied with the reason given, the answer to such a one must be simple. We, the apostles and the churches of God, have no such custom as that women should pray and teach with uncovered head. It has been suggested that the word custom refers not to the uncovering the head, but the contention just mentioned. But the former interpretation seems more natural, and the apostles' object here is not so much to merely censor the contentious spirit as to show how much an objector must be dealt with. It is noticeable that the appeal is made to the practice of the churches, plural, not the church. Thus, it is not the authority of the church as such that is quoted, but is the uniformity of practice and the several Christian churches that is appealed to. The church in Corinth has no right to become exceptional. That's interesting. So there's an appeal here to what the churches are doing. So don't be contentious. Look at what the churches are doing. All right. Well, and in the modern times, if we're to apply that, look at what the churches are doing. Do you need to be contentious over it? Is that the normal practice? Now, let me read this again because I think it's interesting. But if any man seem to be contentious, the argument and the appeal to their own good senses have been completed. The apostle now adds that if, after all, someone continues to argue the matter and is not satisfied with the reason given, the answer to such a one must be simply, we, the apostles and the churches of God, have no such custom as that women should pray and teach with uncovered head. So he's saying that, hey, we don't have any custom anywhere that a woman should pray with an uncovered head. So you should not be contentious because that's the general practice. So at that general practice, it seems to be at that time, according to this, that women did not pray with an uncovered head. Now that doesn't mean, does that mean that women would not pray or prophesy with a head that was shaven, but a woman with long hair that would be her covering? Or are you saying that a woman that did not have a practice of women praying with an uncovered head as far as an additional covering? We have some questions here, all right? But I think it's interesting that what's appealed to is the general practice of the churches. Okay, well, what are the general practices of churches today? Why, if that was the agreed upon custom at that time, and if it wasn't viewed as the hair, then why was that custom abandoned at some point in church history? All right. All right, now here's this commentary goes on. The influence of Paul's instruction as to women not uncovering their heads in public worship has lasted long after the necessity for their particular expression of her relationship to man has passed away. While in succeeding ages, again and again, some have forgotten the principle of the teaching, which are eternal, the particular application of them, which was only temporary, has been continuously and universally observed. Surely this is an illustration and evidence of the divine wisdom which withheld the apostolic writers from, as a rule, laying down minute directions for worship or dogmatic formulas of faith. Men would, in a servile obedience to rules, have soon and completely forgotten the living principles on which they were based. To this day, the universal custom in Christian places of worship of women being covered and men uncovered, and the increasing revolt against the acknowledgement of the subordination of women to man, of which that practice was originally the avowed symbol, is a striking proof of how the same spirit which led Jews of old to be scrupulous in their observance of certain external ordinances, while forgetting the weightier matters of which they were to be the outward expression, were not merely a Jewish, but a human weakness. Now, that's a lot of words. What are they saying here? Here's the problem. What happens over time is that there are those who rise up who want to focus on the symbol. Oh, women need to wear this to show their submission. Women need to wear this to show their submission. But over time, people become so preoccupied with the symbol that the actual reality is not there. The reality is not what a woman needs to be more focused on is her godly humility and submission to God-given authority, not a symbol. Now, I'm not saying at this point, I'm not making an argument against the symbol. I'm just saying that if you become so preoccupied with the symbol that it's crazy. I'll give you an example. I've had in the past women email me about the head coverings. And if I say, well, I'm not so sure I believe that they're required, their response to me was usually filled with arrogance, condemnation, and they showed no godly submission and no respect for someone who preaches and teaches, who has a religious education. They just like, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. Well, where's your godly submission? Where's your godly submission? So I think the issue is, first and foremost, we have to make the most important issue is a woman's attitude towards authority and godly submission to that authority. That is what's paramount here, not the symbol. The symbol becomes meaningless if the reality is not there. You have to focus on the reality. Now the question is, wait a minute, is the woman's hair her covering? Or is this requiring an additional covering? If the hair is not the covering, but the additional covering is what's required, if a woman does not wear that, should she then be forced to have her head shaved? And then what do you do with men with supposed long hair? How are they treated? There's a lot of questions. You've got head coverings and you got hair. You've got two issues here: head coverings and hair. How these two relate and how you manage this, because this is 1 Corinthians is a letter written to a church. So this comes down to how churches handle this, more so than how individuals handle this, because the church has to step in. Okay, you got to wear a head covering. You don't wear a head covering, then this is the consequence. It's the consequence church discipline. It's the consequence you have to have your head shaved. How do you work all of that? All right. Now, okay. I'm looking at some other discussions here, but that's okay. So let's consider this. And I'm throwing out a lot of ideas at you. Now let's try to put this back together. Right. This is super interesting, so I'm glad the person asked the question. All right. 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 16, addresses the issue of women and head covering. The context of the entire passage of 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 16 is submission to the God-given order and chain of command. Now, I think that is very true. Now, I'm going to make an argument here. Now, I need you to hear me out. What I find fascinating about 1 Corinthians 11 is how some people will gravitate to the head covering part. Boom, they'll gravitate to the head covering part. And then when you get to the Lord's Supper part, where we learn that people who partake of it in an unworthy manner die, you'll have churches where the people want head coverings, but then they'll practice an open or close communion and not a closed communion. Why wouldn't you practice a closed communion? Because you would never want to give people the Lord's Supper where people could ultimately die. So I just think sometimes we give the head coverings more weight than what comes next about the Lord's Supper, where people get sick and die by partaking of it in an unworthy manner. Right? So the head coverings get the attention, and then we have a really weird liberal practice when it comes to the Lord's Supper. No, if you're gonna make the head covering a major issue, you can't ignore the Lord's Supper portion here as well. I just think that's interesting. But I want to make sure we understand the context here is about submission to God-given order and chain of command. A covering on a woman's head is used as an illustration of the order, headship, and authority of God. They say the key verse of this article says the key verse of this passage is 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. The implications of this verse are found in the rest of the passage. The order is God the Father, God the Son, the man or husband, and the woman or wife. The veil or covering on the head of a believing Corinthian wife showed that she was under the authority of her husband and therefore under submission to God. I'll make it very clear. having a head covering, but you're not in actual submission, the symbol becomes meaningless and useless. So you've got to focus on the reality of that submission before anything. That's got to be the focus point. What does godly submission look like? Godly submission. And what does godly leadership look like? Not godly abuse and domineering jerk. Okay, we got to make sure we put all of that in its proper context. Within this passage is also verse 10, 1 Corinthians 11:10. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Why is that important to angels? The relationship with God, with men, is something that angels watch and learn from, according to 1 Peter 1:12. Therefore, a woman's submission to God's delegated authority over her is an example to the angels. The holy angels, who are in perfect and total submission to God, expect that we, as followers of Christ, be the same. All right, that's interesting. I don't know if it's helpful, but it's interesting. Now, listen, I want you to pay close attention here. The covering not only means a cloth, but also can refer to a woman's hair length. Now stop right there. So is the cloth required if the woman has long hair, or is a long hair sufficient? That's something to ask. This article says, how can we say that? We must take this verse in the context or the setting in which it is presented. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. 1 Corinthians 11:14-15. Again, I want you to read that again. Her hair is given to her for a covering. Her hair is given to her for a covering. That can't just be thrown out of the passage. Therefore, in the context of this passage, a woman who is wearing her hair long marks herself out distinctively as a woman and not a man. The apostle Paul is saying hear that in the Corinthian culture, right? The apostle is saying hear that in the Corinthian culture. When a wife's hair was longer than her husband, it showed her submission to his headship. The roles of the male and female are designed by God to portray a profound spiritual lesson that is of submission to the will and order of God. So what it seems to be indicating that in that culture, if the woman had longer hair than her husband, it was to demonstrate submission. It was to demonstrate submission ultimately to her husband and ultimately to God. Now again, all of the symbols become irrelevant if there's not true submission. If people are not truly submitted to God and truly the wife submitted to her husband, the husband truly submitted to God, all of the symbols in the world will not matter. So we got to focus on the reality. Everyone wants to focus on the head covering. We got to focus on that reality first. That's something, while you're trying to figure out what to do with the head covering, you can start working on your godly submission to spiritual authority, to your husband, whatever the case may be. All right, that's something that can be discussed. All right. Now, this is important. This is where I was trying to go. Why is hair an issue in this passage? Now, remember when I was just trying to walk through it, just asking questions? That to me is you've got two issues. You've got head covering and hair. How do these two relate? You got the hair of the man, you got the hair of the woman. One, the man should not have long hair because that's a dishonor. And the woman, if she has long hair, that's her glory, that's her covering. So we cannot ignore the hair in this passage. It's got to be considered, all right? The Apostle Paul is addressing an issue related to the Corinthian culture that was being allowed to disrupt the church. For a woman to have a shaved head was a disgrace, and in Jewish thinking, a sign of mourning. And I think Deuteronomy, I believe 21:12, you may want to look that up. I think Deuteronomy 21:12 talks about a shaved head as a sign of mourning. I could be wrong. Her hair was her glory. 1 Corinthians 11:15. In the Corinthian culture, women normally wore a head covering as a symbol of their submission to their husbands. Paul affirms the rightness of the following that cultural mandate to dispense. Paul affirms the rightness of following that cultural mandate To dispense with the head covering on a woman would send the entirely wrong signal to the culture at large. In fact, Paul says that if a Christian woman refuses her head covering, she might as well shave her hair off too. A woman who refused to wear a covering in that culture was basically saying, I refuse to submit to God's order. Therefore, the Apostle Paul is teaching that that hair length or the wearing of covering by the woman was an outward indication of her heart attitude of submission to God and to established authority. All right, so in that culture, that head covering, it appears to be maybe an additional covering other than the hair. Would the hair suffice? Again, we still got to ask those questions, but it seems to be this was a cultural thing happening. Shaved head on a woman, that would have been shown complete rebellion. So again, I think you have to go back to the long hair. So a long hair on a woman would seem to indicate submission to authority. Maybe an additional covering would do that as well, because the culture would have understood it that way. Now you got to remember in 1 Corinthians, you have a lot of issues pertaining to the culture. So guess what? What were you to do? If eating meat offered to an idol was going to cause someone to stumble, then by all means, guess what you were to do? You were to abstain from eating that meat. You would not eat that meat because it was going to cause someone to stumble. In other words, you would give up your right. Well, if you're in a culture, if you're in a situation where if you don't wear that head covering, they interpret that to mean that you're not submissive to your husband and you're not submissive to God, then by all means, give up any freedom that you think you have and put on that head covering. If you're in a situation where if you don't, like let's say you move to an area and you walk into a church and all the women have a head covering, and if you don't have one, they're going to view you as being an unsubmissive, then by all means, give up that right and just put on the head covering while you're in church. Now, for them to force a head covering outside of church, that's when now I think that becomes a form of legalism. This seemed to be inside public worship when praying. And it seems to be when praying or prophesying. So it would seem to be, well, even if you go back to that, then only when the woman is praying, only when the woman is prophesying, right? I mean, is that not what the text says? 1 Corinthians 11:5, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. So maybe you could argue, maybe when praying is happening, she would put one on, or when preaching is happening, she would put on, but it seems to indicate she would be the one doing those things, which raises all kinds of other questions, right? Right? So in other words, the passage has all kinds of problems, but let's make it clear. This was to demonstrate this was a picture of something, to symbolize something. Well, does that symbol mean anything anymore? Now, if you walk into a church and nobody has a head covering and you wear a head covering, are you symbolizing submission? Do they see it that way? Oh, she's more submissive than the rest of us? Look, you show that submission in the way you act. Now, if you go into a church and everyone's wearing a head covering, then by all means, follow that practice because you don't want to cause anyone to stumble. So I think that we got to take the broader context of 1 Corinthians. That's the rule over and over and over. Hey, if you've got a lawsuit against a fellow believer, don't take it to the court system. Or if you've got a problem with a fellow believer, don't file a lawsuit in the world, the courts of the world. Don't do that. That would cause them to stumble. In many cases, you may even be defrauded and allow yourself to be defrauded in order that God is glorified. So if you're in a situation where the women are wearing head coverings, don't be contentious and fight it. Put it on. But if you're in a situation where no one's wearing a head covering, don't be contentious and try to force everyone to do so. And again, what are you symbolizing? Are the women going to go, oh, look, she's wearing a head covering. She's symbolizing godly submission. They're going to be like, why is she wearing that on her head? What's wrong? She got cancer? What's going on? Because you've seen cancer patients obviously wear the head covering. I've worked in the medical world for 22 years, saw that plenty of times. And you'd see the woman there, and sometimes you're like, oh, man. And you would want to walk up and say, how are things going? How are you doing? And in many cases. So because they're covering, because of their radiation treatment, they're losing their hair. So they cover it up with some type of a head covering. All right. So that in the medical world, the head covering doesn't symbolize submission. It symbolizes someone who probably is going through cancer treatment. So, but I'm just saying, if you're the only one in the church, what are you symbolizing? The symbol has to mean something here. All right. Let's see here. So to dispense with the head covering on a woman should send the entirely wrong signal to the culture at large. In fact, Paul says that if a Christian woman refuses her head covering, she might as well shave her hair off too. A woman who refused to wear a covering in that culture was basically saying, I refuse to submit to God's order. Therefore, the Apostle Paul is teaching the Corinthians that hair length, listen, that hair length or, that's a key word, hair length or the wearing of a covering by the woman was an outward indication of a heart attitude of submission to God and to his established authority. So it could be a cloth or hair length could establish the same symbolism. That seems to be what is possibly implied here, right? God's order is that the husband is the head of the wife as God is the head of Christ, but there is no inequality or inferiority implied. God and Christ are equal and united, just as the husband and wife are one. This is not a passage that teaches that woman is inferior to a man or that she should be submissive to every man. It is a teaching God's order and spiritual headship in the marriage relationship. In the Corinthian culture, a woman who covered her head during worship or when she was in public displayed her submission to authority. But again, the symbol is irrelevant if there is no submission. Demonstrate your submission to your husband by being submissive, not by just putting cloth on your head. Now, if the cloth is going to symbolize that and it worked, then the symbol is okay. But hair length appears to possibly be able to do that as well. Now, this is very important. We'll have to end with this. We're almost at an hour, and we didn't even get very far, but that's okay. All right? In today's culture, we no longer view a woman's wearing of a head covering as a sign of submission. That is true. In culture today, a woman has a head covering on. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows, why does she have that on? I remember sometimes when I would go to a local, it was like a local record store. I'd be in that record store, and sometimes women would walk in, and there's not all the time, but I've saw them there multiple times, these two women, and they were, I don't know from what religious background, either like an independent fundamental Baptist, maybe Pentecostal, but they wore the long dresses, and they both had head coverings on. They had head coverings on. And sometimes I wanted to strike up a conversation. I was, too busy looking at music, but I would want to strike up a conversation and go, so why do you have a head covering on while you're inside a record store? Because 1 Corinthians talks about when you're praying or prophesying. So why do you have it on outside? To demonstrate that you're in submission to your husband? You're trying to tell everyone that? Because I don't think anyone in this store has a clue why you have that on. In fact, some may actually think possibly that you have cancer, and that's why you have it. So why do you have it on? So I mean, that's a question that has to be asked. Now, obviously, she can wear whatever she wants on her head, or they, or any other woman can. That's perfectly, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing it. But I'm just saying, you've got to ask yourself, what are you trying? Does it become about? If it becomes about you, that goes against the very concept that's supposed to be established here. But I would argue that in our culture, now, if you're in a culture where it does demonstrate that, well, then that's different. Because Paul seems to say in 1 Corinthians, and a number of situations, hey, if this is if eating meat to an idol causes someone to stumble, you just don't eat it. So if you're in a cultural situation, then you wear the head covering. You wear the head covering. If you're in a predominant Muslim culture, you may want to wear some kind of head covering, to do that. You would want to do that not just to cause an offense, because you would want to be able to hopefully demonstrate how a Christian lives their life, and demonstrate and build a relationship so that you could share Christ with them. Right? So in some situations, you would go with the cultural norm. But in this particular case, I mean, a head covering doesn't seem to show anything. I would be interested in how many people would even interpret it that way, even inside the church. And most modern societies, scarves and hats are fashion accessories. A woman has the choice to wear a head covering if she views it as a sign of her submission to the authority of her husband. However, it is a personal choice and something that should not be used to judge spirituality. The real issue here is her heart attitude of obedience to God's authority and submission to his established order as the Lord. God is far more concerned with an attitude of submission than an outward display of submission via a head covering. 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 10, I also want women to dress modestly, with decency, propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. All right, now, I'll stop with this. I don't know if this answered this question, but it raised a couple of things. So let's summarize. First, I think it's interesting that 1 Corinthians 11 seems to indicate the head covering, if we see this as like a piece of cloth, only being worn during prayer and prophesying. And we'd have to ask when the woman is doing that or when anyone is doing that. I think that's just a very interesting verse right there, especially when you have other parts of 1 Corinthians where it tells the woman to be silent. Right? So that right there raises all kinds of questions. Secondly, 1 Corinthians 11 seems to clearly indicate, verse 15, her hair is given for her for a covering. Can the hair serve as the covering? If it can, then long hair would work. All right? Next, I think it's very important to realize that the issue here is submission. If the symbol becomes more important than the reality, that's an issue, and you should not allow that to happen. Focus on the reality. Look, it's easy to put on a piece of cloth on your head and act like, oh, look at me, I'm spiritual. No, focus on the true submission. That's what you need to focus on first and foremost, okay? Now, here's the thing. If you feel that symbolizes it and you want to show that symbol when you come to church, then all means do so. Just make sure that you're not making it about you. Just make sure it doesn't become a badge of, look how I'm more spiritual than all those other women. All those other women are unsubmissive, women, and I'm the godly one. Don't allow it to become that, because then it doesn't accomplish anything. Here's what I would say. One, if you're in a church where everyone's wearing a head covering, don't cause the trouble, put on the head covering. Number two, if you're in a church where nobody's wearing a head covering and nobody would even interpret it that way, I don't know what you would accomplish by doing so. But if you choose to do so, go to your pastor first and say, hey, I'm becoming convicted about head coverings. I know there's a lot of different views, but I kind of believe that this is biblical. I'm going to do this, but I don't want to cause any trouble, and I'm not going to be trying to, create a movement within the church, starting some kind of problem. I'm just going to do so. If someone asks me, I'm just going to say that I'm convicted I'm convicted, and I feel that I want to wear this to show that I am trying to be submissive to my husband and to my pastor. And you try to be very godly. If it becomes a point of contention in the church, you're not accomplishing anything. All right? And if you become contentious and that becomes your crusade, you're not accomplishing anything. So if you want to wear one, I don't think there's no way to say that it's wrong. There's no way to say that it's wrong. But you have to decide, is it your hair or is it the cloth? And if you wear the cloth, a cloth covering, then by all means do so. Just do so in a godly way. I don't think it's wrong. I just don't know if I can take 1 Corinthians 11, a passage that's found within a book that has all kinds of cultural issues going on. There's all kinds of cultural issues going on in 1 Corinthians, right? I mean, there's a lot of things going on in 1 Corinthians, like, okay, that meat offered unto idols, you got this. And you just got to realize that maybe there was a cultural framework there that's not quite in place now. The emailer asked me a question about how should Christian women apply this today. Let me make it very clear. Here's the first application that has to be first and foremost in your life. Do you have a heart that is submissive to authority? Are you submissive to your pastor? Are you submissive to your husband? A godly submission. I'm not saying submit yourself to abuse. I'm not saying submit yourself to being, not, because you got to state that because so many people misunderstand that. Godly submission to godly authority. That's the number one application. Now, if you're convicted and you feel that you need to wear a head covering, I would never tell you not to. I would just ask you that you check your heart and your reason for doing so, and you don't make it about you. You don't make it about you. That's important. All right. An hour. Wow. That turned into an hour. I told you it was going to be long, but I wanted to work through that a number of different ways. That one verse really threw me off. 1 Corinthians 11. And again, when I work through things this way, sometimes it confuses people, but I work through this in a way like we're working through it together, all right? So I'm going to go back to 1 Corinthians. That one verse threw me off. See, verse 16, but if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. It confused me, but it seems to be what that's saying is we have no such custom other than women not praying, or we have no other custom other than women praying when their heads are covered. But we have no, if you're going to get contentious, then there's no point in getting contentious because that's the only custom we know. But just remember, that was the custom of all the churches. But I want to make it very clear, and I think this is very important because I almost forgot this. Don't forget, I know the next verses start the next section, but don't forget them. Now in this I declare unto you, I praise you not that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For the first of all, when you come together in the church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. If you're going to go to church and you're going to wear a head covering, make sure it's making church better, not worse, and make sure that head coverings don't split a church and cause division, because there's nothing godly in that. There's nothing godly in that. All right? I think that's very important. All right. I know that didn't answer all the questions. I know it did not, but at least sparks the conversation. That was the goal here, to spark the conversation, to struggle through the passage, but read that chapter over and over and over. Try to answer some of those questions. Is the hair the covering? If it is, then you don't need to wear a cloth. Why is the hair and why are they the covering and the hair so linked together? And then if you would say that hair coverings are demanded, then what do you do with men in the church who have longer hair? How do you work? There's lots of questions there that you have to ask. All right, but I'll stop right there. You can email me all of your disagreements to newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. Everyone have a great day. God bless.